All right. Welcome to our part 2 of our school site council training, looking at school plans. We're going to just wait a minute and make sure everyone's in, and then we'll get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is Bonnie McFarland with the LCAP-State and Federal, and we'd like to welcome you to day 2 of our school site council training, and today's focus is school plans. For those of you who are just joining us today, welcome. We had decided this year for our school site council training to pull one full day, one full session on school plans because they are so critical, and that is the primary role of the school site council. So that's going to be our focus today. And joining me from our team is Rachel Garcia, Amy Tomamatsu, and Adrian Balcazar. Amy put a link in the chat to the PowerPoint, and you can access the slides there. And also we will be posting a recording of this after the session is over. So if you miss anything or want to share anything, please feel free to go there and use that. All right, first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge those of you that work with school plans and support schools in doing that work. It is challenging work to do it and to do it right. But it is important work because this is the work that's closest to the schools, closest to the parents, closest to the students. And you really have an opportunity to make an impact. And particularly with Title I schoolwide programs, it's an opportunity for targeting those services to the needs of the school. But it's a lot of work. And my hats are off to those of you who are doing that work. So this is why we all the time are talking about school plans. It's always on our agenda. So let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to have an overview of the school plan for student achievement and the requirements for the plan. We're going to then look more closely at particularly Title I schoolwide programs and those requirements, and one of those being the comprehensive needs assessment. So we'll spend some time looking at that. Another required area, evidence-based interventions. We'll be looking at what that is and what that requirement means. We'll also spend some time on resource inequities, which is a new requirement in the last couple of years added to the planning requirement. Then we'll go through the steps to developing the school plan and look specifically at some particular plans that are embedded in the school plan for student achievement. And that's comprehensive support and improvement and targeted and additional targeted support and improvement, and how those connect to the school plan for student achievement. Finally, we'll look at the alignment and relationships between the LCAP Federal Addendum, and the school plan, and how those documents and plans can work together and support effective school planning. As usual, we'll ask you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll be sending out a Q&A from both days, and we'll get that out within a couple of days, and any questions that you have. If we can answer any along the way, we will, but we want to make sure we get through everything today, and want to make sure we take time to answer your questions fully and completely. Looking at yesterday's questions, you guys asked tough questions, so we appreciate them. And sometimes we have to do some research and thinking to make sure you get the right answer. All right, so I'm going to turn it over now to our first presenter, and we're going to start by looking at the school plan requirements. Okay, I think that's Rachel.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Bonnie mentioned, in this section, we'll be taking a look at the requirements for school plans. Next slide, please. The spirit and the intent behind the school plan for student achievement is the cycle of continuous improvement. It is an ongoing cyclical process whereby schools evaluate outcomes and progress towards goals, engage in strategic planning with stakeholders based on a comprehensive needs assessment, and implement evidence-based actions in an overall effort to improve the educational programs and student achievement at the school. Next slide, please. So which schools must develop a school plan? So school plans are required for Title I schools that operate a school-wide program as per federal Essa requirements. LEAs may also require that its schools develop a school plan. So for example, if a district has some schools that are Title I and some that are not, the district may require all of its schools to develop a school plan regardless of Title I status. Lastly, SPSAs may serve as school improvement plans that are required under federal law for schools identified for targeted support or comprehensive support under Essa. So that would be for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools. Next slide, please. There are a number of legal requirements for school plans at both the state and the federal level. And state requirements for a SPSA are established in Ed Code 64001. In Ed Code 64001C, it states a local educational agency shall ensure in the consolidated application that the SPSA has been prepared in accordance with law, that school site councils have developed and approved a SPSA for each school participating in programs funded through the consolidated application process, and that SPSAs were developed with the review, certification, and advice of the School English Learner Advisory Committee if required. Ed Code 64001I is where we find the requirement for the SPSAs to be reviewed and approved by the local governing board or body of the LEA at a regularly scheduled meeting whenever there are material changes. We often get questions about what is considered a material change, and Ed Code does not define material change. Any change in budget and related program services that might raise questions or mislead stakeholders should be considered material. A 10% budget change in a line item is typically used as a rule of thumb for determining what constitutes a material change. However, depending on the amount budgeted, the impact of a 10% change may have greater or less significance. Next slide, please. So Education Code 64001 specifies that the development of the school plan shall include a comprehensive needs assessment, as well as the identification of the process for evaluating and monitoring the plan. And school site council is responsible for the development of the school plan, so they must therefore be involved in both of these processes. And SSC minutes should also document how the school site council was involved in both of these components. Per Education Code, the content to be included in the plan are goals, evidence-based strategies, actions, or services, and proposed expenditures, including the identification of resource inequities. The school plan goals must address the needs of students and student groups based on the findings of the needs assessment. And the strategies, actions, and services included in the plan must be evidence-based and again address the student needs as determined through the needs assessment process. And finally, the school plan must also include proposed expenditures to address the findings of the needs assessment, including identifying resource inequities. So as you can see, everything is tied back to the comprehensive needs assessment, which is why it is considered the foundation of the school plan. We'll be taking a deeper look at the comprehensive needs assessment process a little later in this presentation. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, there are legal requirements for school plans at both the state and federal levels. This chart highlights key state and federal requirements for school plans with regards to who is responsible for the development of the plan, when the plan should be reviewed and updated, and what components must be included in the plan. The first column lists requirements per education code. The second column lists requirements for Title I school-wide program plans per Essa. And the last column identifies improvement plan requirements for schools identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI per Essa. It's important to note that EdCode allows for the SPSA to serve as the improvement plan for CSI, TSI, and ATSI as long as they meet the federal requirements. So for example, if you have a school that is Title I school-wide and has been identified for CSI, the school is responsible for the components listed in all three columns. However, you can see that most of the requirements are in alignment. For example, a needs assessment is required for school plans per education code and per Essa for school-wide programs, as well as for schools identified for CSI. Next slide, please. Education Code 64001J allows for single school districts and charter schools to use the LCAP to serve as the SPSA, provided that the plan meets federal school planning requirements and the stakeholder requirements established in Education Code Section 52062A, and the plan is adopted at a public hearing. So there are several considerations for a single school district or charter school in determining whether this option would best support your needs. If you select this option, here are a few considerations. First, Title I funded actions and budgeted expenditures must be included in the LCAP. Schools will need to demonstrate in the LCAP how Title I funded actions are based on a comprehensive needs assessment to support the most at-risk students. And also, additional stakeholder requirements per Education Code 52062A would need to be met. And that includes presenting the LCAP to the Parent Advisory Committee and responding in writing to comments received, presenting the LCAP to the EL Parent Advisory Committee if applicable for review and comment, and again, responding in writing to comments received. Notifying the public of the opportunity to submit written comments regarding the specific actions and expenditures proposed to be included in the LCAP. And also consultation with the Special Education Local Plan Administrator, or SELPA. As noted on the slide, this option was not available for the 2020-21 school year. Since there was not a 2020-21 LCAP, single school districts and charter schools were required to develop school plans for the 2020-21 school year. However, the LCAP you're currently developing for the 2021-22 school year may serve as the SPSA for next year, provided the requirements that were just addressed are met. Next slide, please. Statute does not specify a timeline or deadline for when the development and approval of the SPSA must occur. This is a local decision consistent with the needs of the school and local community. This slide lists some considerations that are dependent on your school or district. For example, the timing around the availability of data and budgets, like when schools receive information about budgets that will allow them to plan for proposed expenditures, or when data is available for schools to be able to measure the effectiveness of their actions. Perhaps the process schools are guided to use in terms of adjustments to plans and budgets may play a role in the timeline. Or the election and training process for school site council members. Or the timeline of the LCAP may play a role to ensure alignment with the SPSA. Although there is no required timeline or deadline, It's important to keep in mind that you must have an approved plan to expend funds. For CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools, CDE has indicated that it is the expectation that CSI, TSI, and ATSI plans are fully developed and approved at the local level no later than the first day of the school year. Next slide, please. There is no required template for the school plan. The important thing is that the plan template you use meets the state and federal requirements for school plans. However, the CDE has developed an optional template for school plans. And the CDE is similar in style and format to the old LCAP template. Be aware that the process of developing the SPSA is also equally important, and a school will want to keep evidence of the comprehensive needs assessment, development and approval by the school site council, advisement of the ELAC, as well as your annual evaluation process. And keep in mind that these requirements are also reviewed as part of the Federal Programs Monitoring, or FPM, process. And that concludes my section. So next I will turn it over to Adrienne.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to take a look at school-wide programs and what that means. A school-wide program is a comprehensive program intended to improve the outcomes for all students in a Title I Part A school. There's two types of Title I school programs. There is the Targeted Assistance School Model and the School-Wide Program Model. The Targeted Assistance School Model is the default program for Title I schools. And in this task, they call it task, in this Targeted Assistance School program, services are provided to eligible students based on multiple objective, academically related criteria. And these services must be supplemental to what is being provided for all students at the school. All the strategies, the activities, and the interventions must be evidence-based. The other Title I model is the school-wide program. And so the purpose of the school-wide program is to improve the academic achievement throughout the school for all students, but especially for the lowest achieving students. A school must meet the eligibility requirements in order to implement a school-wide program at the school site. A school is eligible if the school serves a school attendance area in which less than 40% of the children are from low-income families, or not less than 40% of the children enrolled in the school are from low-income families. If a targeted assistance school meets the eligibility criteria, they can move to a school-wide program. The school-wide program requires these steps to be followed. 1, a year-long planning process. 2, a comprehensive needs assessment. 3, a school-wide plan. And 4, an annual evaluation. In the school-wide program, the school does not require the identification of individual students for services as it did in the task model. And the allowability of costs for services is based mainly on the school-wide plan and the comprehensive needs assessment that took place. The LEA must determine if a school is ready to implement a school-wide program. And so in this process, it's a year-long process. And so we're looking at the current status of the program. What is the understanding and difference between that? And how will the school-wide program improve the academic achievement of your lowest performing students? And how does the school determine, or the district determine, if the school is ready to upgrade their entire educational program? So what we have in place is a readiness rubric that we have available. And this rubric looks specifically at the school's leadership, the vision and mission, the collaboration, commitment to equity, the use of data to drive instruction, the planning processes, and the differentiation that takes place in the classroom. And this also determines what level of support the district will need to provide for the school as they transition to a school-wide program. The LEA can use this readiness rubric to determine where the school currently places on the rubric. So the LEA will reflect on the leadership at the school and with the vision and mission of the school and its level of articulation and implementation. For the collaboration, the district will look at what does that look like among the staff? And what is the school's level of commitment to equity? And how does the school use data to drive instruction? What specific processes or tools does the school use and structure in terms of their day-to-day collaboration? Also, does the school have a planning process already in place, or does one need to be created, or the one existing needs to be modified? And also looking at the level of the knowledge of teachers in differentiation in the classroom. And does it meet the needs of all students? So that the readiness rubric will allow the district to determine if the district is, or school site is ready to transition to that program. The next part of the process is the comprehensive needs assessment. And in this, once the district determines that the school is ready, the comprehensive needs assessment will take into account the entire school's information on the academic achievement of the students in relation to the state academic standards. And it will take a deeper look at the needs of the failing or at risk of failing students. Once the comprehensive needs assessment has been completed, the school will now develop a school-wide plan. The Title I School-Wide Plan must include these components. It must include a comprehensive needs assessment, the plan development input and process, the plan content, which includes the strategies, the actions, and the services that are going to be provided. There has to be a section about the annual evaluation as well as the budget. It needs to be included in the plan. And if this plan is going to consolidate other plans within it, there needs to be a list of programs that are being consolidated. When developing the school-wide plan, it is important to remember that there are specific authorized uses of the Title I funds. It is not a pot of money to be used on anything for the school once the school is now school-wide. On the CDE's website, you can find the webpage that explains the criteria for the allowable expenditures with Title I funds. And these slides show the different components. So this slide is the allowable uses for both the targeted assistance schools as well as the school-wide program schools. And here you can see that it must be, the activity or expenditures must be aligned to the challenging state and academic content standards. It must be evidence-based. It must be reasonable, necessary, and allocable to the program. It must supplement, and it must be used for the current fiscal year in that, or that subsequent fiscal year. So this applies to all Title I programs, no matter which model you are using. This next slide shows that in the school-wide program, in addition to 1 through 5, the requirements include 6 through 10. So here we look at states how the activities and expenditures must meet an identified need from your comprehensive needs assessment. And this has to, it should be either referenced in it or at least somewhere it can be found that it is directly implement or affecting the actions and services. Also, the plan has to be approved by your local governing board, and that your school site council will be able to annually evaluate and monitor the implementation of these activities that are stated within the school plan. If your school is a target assistance school, then you will follow the numbers 1 through 5 from the other slide, and also numbers 11 through 13 on this slide. And if you're in a targeted assistance school, the activities are for specifically identified students based on multiple educationally related criteria. And the progress of these specific students must be reviewed on an ongoing basis in order to annually revise your Title I program. The last requirement for a school-wide program is the annual evaluation. And so this is where your school site council must annually evaluate the progress of the programs or activities towards accomplishing the goals. And it must be determined whether the needs of all the students have been met through these strategies, especially on the needs of low achieving students. And now Rachel is going to go over the comprehensive needs assessment process in a more depth way.
Thank you, Adrienne. Hello again, everyone. Next slide, please. So what is a comprehensive needs assessment? And this is a question that we field frequently, often followed by the question, do you have a template that we can follow? At its most basic, a comprehensive needs assessment is a process or procedure that is used to identify and address factors between current outcomes and desired outcomes. And this process must include steps to provide clarity about the current situation and then identify what is needed to attain the desired student outcomes. The goal of the needs assessment is to help educators identify, understand, and prioritize the needs that the district or schools must address to improve student outcomes. It's important to note that the findings yielded through a comprehensive needs assessment are only accurate as long as the LEA or school context remains the same. Given the current situation with the pandemic, school closures, and distance learning over the past year, it's very likely that student needs have greatly increased and are drastically different when compared to this time last year. The current context really stresses the importance of conducting a comprehensive needs assessment. Next slide, please. A needs assessment for improvement is a systemic process to identify the strengths and weaknesses within the context and constraints of the school or district and dig deeper into root causes. Identifying areas of weakness is an essential first step toward identifying and addressing root causes of poor performance. Root cause analysis is an important part of the needs assessment process because it addresses the problem rather than the symptoms of the problem. The needs assessment process leads to the development of a plan to improve student outcomes. Next slide, please. So a needs assessment for improvement is not an isolated tool. Essentially, it's the first step in the continuous improvement cycle, which includes understanding root causes that contribute to the prioritized needs, selecting evidence-based interventions that address those needs, preparing for and implementing selected strategies and interventions, and then evaluating whether or not those strategies are addressing the needs and achieving the desired outcomes. The needs assessment is the foundation for the school plan. So all strategies and actions should be informed by and aligned with the data. And implementing a successful needs assessment leads to aligned acts of school improvement rather than random acts. Next slide, please. So there is not one correct way to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment. And one resource that highlights a needs assessment process is the State Support Network Needs Assessment Guidebook, produced by the American Institute for Research under the US Department of Education. This guidebook supports the development and facilitation of a needs assessment process and lays out 5 phases of needs assessment implementation. So that includes planning, collecting and organizing data, interpreting information, determining priorities, and connecting to implementation. The guidebook also provides guiding questions and key considerations for each phase of the process. And we've included the link to the guidebook at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. So the first phase of this process is the planning phase. And the planning phase lays the groundwork for the rest of the needs assessment process. It involves defining the desired outcomes and creating a plan to achieve them. And some of the key questions to consider during the planning phase include, why are we engaging in the needs assessment? Who are the key stakeholders? How will they be engaged in the process, and at what points in the process? You'll also want to consider what core topics will the needs assessment cover. So for example, instruction, assessment, achievement, school climate, and also how will the results be shared with stakeholders? So these are all key questions to consider during the planning phase. Next slide. So the next phase is collecting and organizing data. Data is a foundational component of the needs assessment process. This phase involves collecting various forms of data and organizing it in a way that is understandable and useful for your stakeholders who will be involved in interpreting the data. And so again, here are just some key questions to consider during this phase. So what data is readily available from existing sources? So for example, CASP data, LPAC, graduation rate, is it attendance data, or local assessments such as benchmark data? Another key question is, what additional data is needed? And what are the best ways to collect this data? So for example, this could include survey data, observation data, focus groups, and interviews. And how will the data be presented in a way that is easily understood by stakeholders? Next slide, please. So the next phase of the needs assessment process is interpreting information. And during this phase, stakeholders examine data to draw conclusions, identify trends, and begin to identify improvement needs. So some of the questions to consider during this phase are, what does the data reveal? What are the strengths and challenges of the current school program? Were there any themes or trends that emerged when multiple data sources were cross-referenced or triangulated across a given topic? Does the evidence gathered support staff assumptions about strengths and needs? And finally, how can we articulate what we have learned from the data without casting blame? Next slide, please. So the next phase is determining priorities. And through the needs assessment process, it is likely that multiple needs or concerns will emerge. This phase involves prioritizing the needs so that improvement efforts are directed toward a manageable set of priorities. So some of the key questions to consider during this phase are, what findings or themes have emerged that, if addressed, will have the greatest impact on student outcomes? And how many priorities can the school realistically address simultaneously? Is additional data needed to make informed decisions about priorities or capacity for implementation? Next slide, please. And the final phase is connecting to implementation. During the final phase of the needs assessment process, this takes the results and turns those results into something actionable. So during this phase, stakeholders dig deeper to understand root causes of prioritized needs so that they can connect to the relevant goals. The process of understanding the root causes of prioritized needs informs the selection of appropriate evidence-based interventions. And so here are just some key questions to consider during this phase. What are the potential underlying root causes of the prioritized needs or concerns? And how will the school connect needs assessment results to the selection of evidence-based intervention and implementation of those interventions? And again, the findings from the needs assessment process are really the foundation for the school plan and that continuous improvement cycle. Next slide, please. So here is a tool that we created to summarize the needs assessment process and findings. So per the Code of Federal Regulations, schools operating a Title I school-wide program must document how the needs assessment was conducted, the results it obtained, and the conclusions it drew from those results. So this tool would serve that purpose by summarizing who was involved in the process and how, identifying what data was reviewed, the results of the data, the conclusions drawn, as well as the prioritized needs and the potential root causes of those needs. Some districts require schools to include a summary of the needs assessment process and findings within the school plan. Schools must document the process and findings, whether it's included in the school plan or in a separate document. So you just need to have some sort of process to document the comprehensive needs assessment. And I believe we are sharing this tool in the chat so that you have access to it. Next slide, please. District leaders need to determine what level of support is needed with the comprehensive needs assessment. And it's likely that schools will be in different places and need different levels of support. And so here are just a few ways that districts could support schools with the comprehensive needs assessment process. So first, ensuring that schools understand what it is and the purpose. Also, training school administrators and school site councils on how to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment, and supporting school administrators and school site councils in understanding the dashboard, data analysis, and also how to conduct a root cause analysis. And I believe that concludes my section. So now I will turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to start next with the section on evidence-based interventions. Next slide, please. Evidence-based interventions are practices or programs that have evidence to show that they are effective at producing results and improving outcomes when implemented. ESEA has consistently directed educators to implement interventions grounded in research. Under No Child Left Behind, districts and schools were called to use scientifically based research as the foundation for education programs and interventions. This was replaced by the term evidence-based interventions under ESEA. This shift was designed to help increase the impact of educational investments by ensuring that interventions being implemented have proven to be effective in leading to desired outcomes, namely improving student achievement. The requirement for evidence-based interventions does not require LEAs to conduct their own research, but instead, the LEA must plan to implement interventions, strategies, and approaches that have demonstrated effectiveness by prior studies. And there are certain websites that provide information on evidence-based practices as a reference tool. Next slide. So we're going to take a look at the different tiers of intervention as stated in ESEA. And the tiers of evidence ratings are determined by research study criteria. The more controlled criteria provide an increase in the strength of the evidence. So we have tier 1, which is strong evidence, and that's the highest level of evidence available. To qualify as having this high level of evidence, the intervention must have at least one well-designed and well-implemented experimental study to support it. This means a randomized controlled experiment occurred with a treatment group that received intervention and a control or comparison group that did not receive the intervention. So participants in each group are randomly assigned. And that is what would constitute a tier 1 study of providing strong evidence. In tier 2, the moderate evidence category, they must have had at least one well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental study to support it. A control experiment with a treatment group was conducted with the group that received the intervention and a control group that did not. Participants in these groups are not randomly assigned, so the comparison group might not take into account the impact of factors such as socioeconomic status, gender, self-selection, to not participate, etc. So while there might be a group to compare it, it may not be a comparable group as it would have been created through random assignment. So this makes it a moderate tier 2 intervention. In tier 3, they're calling this the promising evidence category. For this, they must have had at least one well-designed and well-implemented correlational study to support it. A study, not an experiment, took place to determine if a relationship exists between the intervention and a given outcome. It's usually done through data collection and analysis within the correlation study, and the intervention must have shown a statistically significant effect. So that's just kind of a brief overview of tier 1, 2, and 3. And for schools in CSI, they're looking that the evidence-based interventions are within those 3 tier levels. Tier 4, also on the slide, involves interventions that demonstrate a rationale. And those are interventions that have a clear and effective logic model or theory of action, which explains how the intervention is likely to improve relevant outcomes. They're supported by research, and there's an effort in place by the state, district, charter, or outside research organization to determine their effectiveness. On the next slide, this is just a screenshot of section 8101 of ESEA that defines the distinction between evidence-based strategies that have been proven to have a statistically significant effect on improving student achievement and those that demonstrate a rationale or likelihood based on research to date. And so these criteria are reflected in those 4 tiers we saw on the previous screen. Next slide, please. So in these next several slides, we'll be sharing some resources to support the connections to evidence. On this slide, there's a link to a 13-minute video that CDE has posted about using, generating, and sharing evidence-based intervention strategies to support students. And towards the bottom of this slide, we have a link to the federal guidance addressing using evidence to strengthen education investments. ESEA emphasizes the use of evidence-based activities, strategies, and interventions, which it collectively refers to as interventions. This guidance is designed to help SEAs, LEAs, schools, educators, partner organizations, and other stakeholders successfully choose and implement interventions that improve outcomes for students. Part 1 of the guidance reviews steps for effective decision-making in the cycle of continuous improvement. And part 2 of the guidance recommends considerations, resources, and criteria for identifying evidence-based interventions based on each of ESSA's 4 evidence levels. Next slide. So some databases that provide ratings for evidence-based programs and practices are included on the CDE website. So we've taken a screenshot here for you and provided the link. And those include such as evidence for Essa database through Johns Hopkins University Center for Research and Reform in Education. The What Works Clearinghouse, which is an initiative of the Institute for Education Sciences through the U.S. Department of Education. There's additionally a document included highlighting evidence-based strategies specific to high schools. And these are all resources that are a result of using rigorous standards to review evidence of effectiveness on a wide range of interventions. And it also summarizes the settings and populations in the studies. Next slide. This is the homepage of the What Works Clearinghouse. And also on the the link is provided there for you. On the next slide, as you dig into different interventions that are available through this What Works Clearinghouse, they provide, this is just a little screenshot that shows you the type of information that you can find for each of these. And they are calling them the evidence snapshot report. You can find the ratings for effectiveness and improvement and whether or not the intervention meets the What Works Clearinghouse standards. The next slide is the homepage screenshot for the evidence for Essa. And this is a database that aims to provide clear and authoritative information on programs that meet the Essa evidence standards and enables educators and communities to select effective educational tools to improve student success. And as you can see, they have information on programs in reading, math, social emotional learning, attendance, science, and writing. So they've kind of expanded the areas over time. The next slide provides a screenshot for evidence of evidence for Essa to kind of give you a sense for the type of information you might see there when you click on a program. The next slide is a link and resource from WestEd. And this one provides tools for looking at current practice, as well as a tool for supporting LEAs to develop an approach for working with schools to select evidence-based interventions. So they have some documents there, the ones that are kind of circled in red there that are helpful for LEAs for that purpose. The next slide is the guidance from the U.S. Department of Ed. And here we did talk about the part 1 of the guidance, reviewing steps for effective decision-making related to evidence-based interventions. And that starts with engaging in timely and meaningful consultation with a broad range of stakeholders, families, students, educators, community partners, to examine the data relevant to understanding the needs of students, schools, and educators, and taking them through understanding the potential root causes of those needs. Then following the needs assessment, the process moves through different steps. Next, you have the selection of evidence-based interventions, considering local school, district, and school level resources. You have the plan for implementation, then implementation, and then the reflection to determine the impact of the plan. So the cycle process that they help facilitate through this document. Part 2 of the guidance provides guidance on the definition of evidence-based interventions, focusing on the strength of the evidence determined through the research criteria that gets applied. They provide considerations, resources, and criteria for identifying those evidence-based interventions based on each of the 4 evidence levels. On the next slide, wanted to make a connection because for our districts or charters that have schools in CSI, Comprehensive Support and Improvement status, we know that in the LCAP, there are prompts that need to be responded to. And so here we have how the process outlined aligns with the requirements for district support for CSI schools. In the LCAP summary section, LCAP plan summary section, LEAs are required to describe how the LEA supported CSI schools in developing the CSI plan. That included the school level needs assessment, evidence-based intervention selection, and identification of any resource inequities. And so we've kind of shown here in prompt 2 and prompt 3 where these steps of the process from the guidance kind of do align. Next slide, please. We're going to move into resource inequities. Next slide. So this is the third element that shall be included in an SPSA as defined by section 64001 of the Education Code. This slide references that Ed Code, which states that all the SPSA shall include the needs assessment, evidence-based strategies, and proposed expenditures, including the identification of resource inequities. Want to give reference to this Ed Code because The identification of resource inequities in statute reads as a requirement of all SPSAs, but we want to point out that you may come across some inconsistencies regarding this requirement. And if we take a look at the next slide, I'm going to show you one of those inconsistencies. In the CDE's SPSA template, the identification of resource inequities is clearly required for CSI and ATSI schools, as it states both in the instructions for the template and also in the FPM instrument. This was something that you'll find if you pull the SPSA template off the CDE website. It's less clear in this template instructions, if the process is required for all schools to review resource inequities. As you saw on the prior slide, EdCode does suggest it's a requirement of all SPSAs in general, but this CDE template suggests that this section can be deleted if a school is not identified for CSI or ATSI. We believe that there is value in including a review of resource inequities as part of the process of identifying needs and potential areas to address in the process of school planning and continuous improvement. So we just wanted to make you aware of this as we go through the resource inequities and what that might look like for your schools and for your district. That might be something you really want to consider. Next slide, please. This slide provides an overview of program requirements for CSI and ATSI schools and highlights that reference to the requirement for identification of resource inequities. It's doubly clear that the identification of resource inequities is a requirement for all schools identified for CSI and ATSI. For schools in CSI, the LEA is required to support the schools in the process of developing the school plan. And that's the description that belongs in the LEA's LCAP, which we saw on the prior slides. Next slide. Here, the purpose of a review of resource inequities is described on the CDE's CSI, as described on the CDE's CSI webpage. The review of data around resource inequities can be used to identify, diagnose, and address sources of inequity to inform improvement decisions. This review can go hand in hand with the needs assessment process with a lens on equity. The review of various potential sources of inequity would then be areas that are targeted and addressed in a school plan. Next slide. A review of resource inequities is not only about money. It's not only about the allocation of funds to the school. It is about the allocation and use of resources. Beyond the dollars that get allocated to a school, it's also about the people and time and resources that are used to create equitable learning experiences for all students. Next slide. Again, we're turning to CDE's website and their explanation of resource inequities. It is stated that part of the needs assessment could be the review of budgeting, and where resource inequities can inform the assessment of effectiveness of actions or strategies. The paragraph here suggests that an LEA might consider a review of resource inequities as part of their LCAP process as well. And while not generally required for LCAP, it is a requirement for single school districts and charter schools using the LCAP to meet SPSA requirements. Those who do use the LCAP to meet SPSA requirements will need to include this component in the LCAP. Next slide. Continuing with the ways in which an LEA or school may review resource inequities, the CDE states that we can look beyond budgeting. For example, ways in which a program may be unfair or lack inclusion. We may also look at resource allocation within districts or within schools as a potential area of equity concerns. For example, lower quality books or materials, less access to labs, outdated technology, class size, and distribution of highly effective or experienced teachers. So those aren't necessarily tied to funding allocated to the schools, but they would point to programs and practices in place in these schools and other resources. So LEAs are asked to identify current strategies and practices that may be contributing to the identified inequities. And these are what can be brought to light and addressed in the school planning process. The next slide takes a look at those terms, fairness, inclusion, a little bit more. We know that students who come to school with greater needs require greater resources to reach the same high learning outcomes. We also understand that personal characteristics such as gender or ethnicity should not stand as obstacles to achievement. We also understand that we must hold the same high expectations for all students, and failing to do so in itself could be an inequity. Therefore, any gaps we see between student groups should be considered potential symptoms of resource inequities. When we see a disproportionate representation of one student group with high rates of dropouts or attendance or discipline or achievement, schools are compelled to review what might be contributing to these issues. What might be the conditions that could be addressed to move towards a more equitable outcomes for all students. And this is how the review of resource inequities is really tied very closely to your needs assessment process, because we're looking at that data and determining where the data we're seeing might be symptomatic of these resource inequities. Taking a look at the next slide. Now, after all of that presentation of what we see on CD website, we want to share an external resource. This one is a framework for districts and schools going through this process of reviewing potential resource inequities, created by Jonathan Travers. He explored and he framed 11 dimensions of resource equity and developed a set of diagnostic questions that can help a system self-assess. He classified dimensions 1 through 7 here on the screen as factors that directly impact the student experience, and 8 through 11 as indirect. In longer presentations in the past, we have spent some time explaining each of these 11 areas, but for today's workshop, I'd like to share a copy of the article, which is linked here to the slide, and a resource that LACO developed, which is going to appear on the next slide. So let's take a look at that, and I'm going to copy and paste the link to this in the chat. Done. Okay, so adapted from Travers, this resource takes each of the 11 dimensions of resource equity and poses a set of questions to help districts or schools self-assess their current system. A district may choose to support schools in identifying a smaller number or targeted subset of dimensions to review. We've been asked, does this mean, we need to look at all 11 of these areas? It's a lot of diagnostic questions for a school site to go through. And so that's really something that, especially for schools in CSI, that the district is supporting through the process, can support. They can be helpful in helping the school target their attention towards certain areas based on the data that they're seeing. So based on that needs assessment and the achievement or opportunity gaps that may be symptomatic of potential resource inequities, there may be certain areas that you want to dive into a little deeper. And so this is linked in the chat. On the next slide, another resource that can be accessed through the website for the Alliance for Resource Equity. And they did base this work on Travers and that of others, but they've now packaged it into a nice round 10 dimensions. You might notice that they're largely the same as Travers' 11 dimensions. The difference being that family academic engagement was broadened in scope to include climate, environment, and positive relationships in a dimension they now call positive and inviting school climate. And the early intervention and whole child approach in Travers' framework, they were previously 2 separate dimensions, has been combined into one here. They call student supports and intervention. This website also provides resources for schools and stakeholders to facilitate the process of reviewing resource inequities. You'll find similar like diagnostic questions and things to think about in each of these areas. So really just broadening our perspective around what does resource inequity and resource equity entail beyond allocation of funds to schools. So in that question, have you reviewed and identified resource inequities? It's not just about money being equitably distributed to schools, but what about all these other areas? School funding is the first one there, but teacher quality, diversity, school leadership, all these different areas that potentially could result in symptoms of inequity. And the next slide, just wanted to provide a potential discussion starter to help districts and schools create a common language and to facilitate a meaningful discussion around resource inequity. LEA and school leaders can ask themselves what it means to provide all students with an opportunity to achieve educational excellence. At the system level, looking at equity or inequity across schools and or across different student groups. At the school level, looking at inequity across classrooms, across grade levels, perhaps across department or content areas and or student groups. Different ways to look at possible inequity issues. And so these are some additional questions that may be used to start those discussions and how you might look at the process and look at how the process can be embedded into your overall SPSA development process for continuous school improvement. And that's the end of resource inequities. We're going to take it to the next presenter, Adrian, looking at steps to develop the SPSA. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Wow. I know all of you have been going, have been with us for the last, yesterday and today. That's a lot of information. And so you've heard Essa, you've heard Ed Code, you've heard the legal requirements within the school site council and the school plans. And there's been a lot of information for you personally, and then also for you to share with your stakeholders and your school site council. So how do you operationalize everything that we have covered in these two workshops? So we're going to take a deeper look into the process of developing your school plan and what that looks like at the school site. So CDE recommends that this 7-step process to developing your school plan is a great way of operationalizing your process. So first, you're going to analyze student achievement data. Secondly, you're going to measure the effectiveness of your current strategies. You're going to identify the goals and the key improvements. And within that plan, you're going to define the timelines, personnel, and expenditures. Then you're going to recommend the school plan to the local governing board. Then you will implement the school plan. And then the last step is to monitor the implementation of the school plan. And as you continue with this cycle, then you would just repeat it as you continually annually review your school plan each year. So let's take a closer look at each step. So within the first step, step 1 says that the SPSA must be based on an analysis of verifiable state and local achievement data. So with this, you can use the CAS or perhaps in the interim of the data gap, some local data to inform your analysis. Also the LPAC for English learners, and also any other local benchmark assessments or curriculum embedded assessment data. Step 2 is to look at the measuring the effectiveness of the current improvement strategy. So whether it's through your comprehensive needs assessment or looking at your resource inequities, all of these processes kind of play into looking at what's currently happening and what strategies do you have in place, and are you seeing the results that you want to? And so as you are conducting this and you're collecting your data, you want to make sure that your school site council understands the relationship between what's happening currently in your instructional program and the data that you're sharing with them. You want to be able to give them an accurate assessment and thoughtful analysis and actually tools to help them process that. So you want to make sure that they can see the connection to what the school has decided to implement, what's working, what's not, and perhaps seeing what changes need to take place. And so all of that information needs to be utilized at this part of the step in step 2. In step 3, you're identifying your goals and the key improvements. So here you're looking at what's the district's plan, what's the goals for the district priorities and the expectations, and your LCAP federal addendum, those are on a district level. And so your SSC and all your stakeholders need to know, like the bigger overarching theme about what's happening at a district level in order to align it to the school level goals. And as the goals are established, they need to be in alignment with that, and that the related expenditures are based on the goals that your school site council has identified. And when writing these goals, they should be the SMART goals, and we know that as being specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So we want to be able to make sure that everyone understands the goal and how it's going to be implemented. Step 4 in the development of your school plan is involving the timelines, the funding, expenditures, and appropriate personnel. So as you're looking at your data and you're determining, yeah, this is great, we want to do this, but sometimes when I go shopping, I see something I really like, but I got to look at the checkbook in order to determine. So the same thing applies here. If we're going to implement an action, we need to make sure that we know the cost, we know the timeline, we know how much it's going to cost, and whether we have the money or not, and who's going to be responsible in terms of personnel and ensuring that it is being implemented and that there's assistance throughout the way of the implementation of the services and the actions. And so remember that this has to fall in line with the Title I requirements, that it supplements the program, the general program, and that it is reasonable and necessary, and that services are required by the state law, and that let me reword that your school site council understands that this is a supplemental program, and that means that services you can't include in your school plan to use Title I money to pay for services that are required by state law, as well as providing services for ineligible students if you have a target assistance program. So again, making sure that everyone understands what's reasonable and allowable. Step 5 is looking at the process where you ask for the recommendation of the school plan. You ask for approval and you submit it to your local governing board. And so by signing the school plan, the school site council is assuring that the school site council has properly been constituted, that the composition, and that ties into yesterday's training about having the correct school site council composition, that the school has reviewed its legal responsibilities and has sought the input from the advisory committees, whether it's ELAC or any other committees that you have gained advice from. And then also that the reviewed content requirements for all the programs are included, and that within this plan, that the plan is based on the analysis of current practices connected to the student academic performance. And so once this has been recommended for board approval, it should be approved by the board, and after they have reviewed the plan. A reminder about the role of district governing board. Sometimes we get questions about this in terms of what does that mean? And so a reminder about the role of district governing board is that they are to adopt the policies as they relate to the school plan. They also can approve or disapprove the plan. So if they disapprove the plan, they can actually send it back to the school site and ask for more clarification, and they do this in writing, and they make sure that then the school site council can go back and make the revisions necessary and then send it back. And so also too, the Board of Education has to ensure that the school plans are aligned to the LEA and that they meet the federal funding requirements. The next step in this process is step 6, and that's the actual implementation of the school plan. So once your SPSA has been board approved, the site and the district administration are responsible for implementing and evaluating the activities in the school plan. The administration of the plan includes assigning, directing, and supervising a person over the service or the action, purchasing materials and equipment, and doing the accounting and the fiscal part of the project fund. The administration may also support the planning process by providing any training and information to the school site council as responsible, for the advisory groups or by developing any proposals for the school site council to consider. So again, at this point, there has to be that interaction with the school site council as it is being implemented. And then the last step is step 7, which is the monitoring of the implementation. And so legally, the school site council is responsible for monitoring the effectiveness of these actions and activities and modifying them if they see that they are ineffective. So sometimes mid-year, there might be changes to the school plan if perhaps, say, an intervention of an activity that was, say, an intervention that was proposed, and let's say that it hasn't started yet, and so there might be a need to modify that particular activity in order to meet the needs of those students. So, the school plan and the process is to continuously monitor the level of implementation. So sometimes it's good to have in your agendas a standing item on your agenda that kind of informs your school site council about where in the level or the implementation of your actions, where is it at? So at the beginning of the year, you might let them know, the school site council know you have these actions. And then once the activity has started, you could give a little, like an update. And then at the end, kind of sharing, this is the effectiveness and this is what happened. So again, you want to make sure that your school site council is a part of this process in a big way. So all of this is the cycle of, implementing and creating and developing your school plan. And then again, as I said before, it's a continuous cycle. And so you're continuously improving and making sure that the actions and services that you have stated are actually giving you the outcome that you are desiring and that they really are meaningful for those students that are lowest achieving and at risk of failing. And so it's important that, you see how it all connects, because it really does connect. And so now moving to the next section, as we talked about a little bit before about schools that were identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. We have, if a school has been identified for any of these improvement statuses, the LEA, in partnership with the school and these stakeholders, must locally develop and implement a plan to improve the student outcomes for those students that were identified or had, they were identified because of and are in CSI, TSI, and ATSI. So what we do know is that Ed Code allows the SPSA to serve as a school improvement plan for these 3 areas. And, but again, the plan must include for CSI, the plan must be based on a school level needs assessment informed by all indicators, that it includes evidence-based interventions, and it identifies resource inequities, as Amy had covered. And just note that ATSI has the same requirements as CSI, but TSI does not require evaluation of resource inequities. And so you will see that we will share, again, one of the charts that kind of spells that out for you. So what if your school is CSI, TSI, ATSI, but not receiving Title I money? Well, the state says all CSI, TSI, and ATSI identified schools are required to develop a school plan to address school needs. So if you do not receive Title I funds and that school is identified, the school needs to create a school site council and develop a school plan. So therefore, your school must have a compliant school site council composition, following all those requirements and following the process for developing the school plans. So nobody, it applies to all if you are identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. So here is a table that explains what is required for the TSI, CSI, ATSI. So for example, if you look at the responsibility for plan development in the far left column, you will see for CSI schools, the LEA has the responsibility for the plan development and implementation. compared to the ATSI school, where the school is responsible for the plan development and implementation. So again, just making sure that depending on what, if your school has been identified for CSI or TSI, ATSI, that you're clear with all the legal requirements and components of the school plan. And again, we have here the table that was shared earlier. And here we can see that the highlighted sections here are the key state and federal requirements for school plans. And we know that the last column here identifies the improvement plan requirements for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools per Essa. So again, we just want to make sure that you have all of these tools available for you, because as you're getting questions, and it's really good to have this quick reference so that you can organize it in your own head. And so now we will hear from Bonnie, who will discuss how the LCAP, the federal addendum, and the school plans are and should all be aligned and connected to your district's goals and outcomes.
Thanks, Adrienne. So we're coming down the home stretch here, and we want to briefly take a look at other required planning documents and how they align with and how they impact the school plan. So let's take a look first at what those documents are and what the purpose of each of them is. So the LCAP is an LEA or district level document, and it's a plan for all students, and it's meant to describe how the district is supporting all students and student groups to achieve in the 8 state priority areas. In addition, the LCAP must demonstrate how the LEA is providing increased or improved services for the 3 targeted pupil groups: low-income students, English learners, and foster youth, in proportion to the additional funds the LEA receives for those students. Next is the LCAP Federal Addendum. And this is a little different. It's still an LEA level document. However, the purpose is to describe how the LEA is meeting federal requirements by supplementing the LEA's program. So how are you meeting federal requirements in the context of your local district? Finally, the school plan for student achievement is a school level versus an LEA level document, and it's based on a comprehensive needs assessment, and it's very specific to how Title I funds will be used to improve academic achievement for all students, but particularly students at risk of not meeting state standards. So the school plan is about addressing achievement gaps. Let's look at the relationship among those. So if you look at this slide, we try and give an overview of how these plans relate to each other. First of all, the LCAP is what should be setting the LEA goals, outcomes, and priorities. Second, you have the addendum, which shows how the supplemental federal funds are supporting those LEA goals. So again, there's a connection to the LCAP, but it's showing how the supplemental funds are meeting federal requirements, but in light of LEA goals and priorities. Finally, school plans for Title I schools should describe how the school is using their Title I funds to close achievement gaps, but LEAs may also require non-Title I schools to develop school plans, and they may ask them to describe in that plan how specific LCAP actions are being implemented at the school site. Again, required for Title I, but optional for other schools at the district's discretion. The next chart shows a comparison of the 3 documents. And you'll notice the addendum column's a different color. And that's because the LCAP and the school plan for student achievement are plans. The addendum, on the other hand, is more of a descriptor of how the requirements at the federal level are being met. The chart shows where the requirements for each of these comes from, and what the timing is for each of those submissions, what the approval process is, and what the program or student focus is, and finally, what is the locus of decision making. So if you look at the LCAP, The basis for this requirement is in state education code and state regulations developed by the State Board of Education. The school plan, on the other hand, is based on federal Title I statute, but it's important to remember it also includes requirements based on state education code. So all the development of the plan is detailed in state ed code, but the basic plan requirements are in federal law. The addendum is a federal requirements based on federal law, and it's in statute for Essa programs Title 1, 2, 3, and 4. The timing also differs. The LCAP is a 3-year plan submitted annually. The school plan should be reviewed and approved annually, whereas the addendum is submitted once per ESEA authorization, but it needs to be updated locally on an annual basis whenever there are changes to how the district is implementing those federal programs. So there should be a match between what you're doing with your title programs and what it says in your addendum. The approval is also different for each of them. The approval for the LCAP for districts is at the county office level. Charters are approved by their governing board, and county offices are approved by the California Department of Education. School plans are locally approved, first by the School Site Council and the local governing board, as Adrian shared. And finally, the addendum is approved at the state level by the California Department of Education. The focus, there are some similarities and differences. The LCAP focuses on all students and increased or improved services for your 3 targeted groups: low income, English learners, and foster youth. The school plan focuses on low achieving students in high poverty schools, and that's the essence of Title I. And finally, the addendum varies with programs. So the requirements are different for each program and the students' focus is different. However, most of the Essa programs include a requirement for prioritizing high poverty or low achieving CSI schools. And decision-making, the locus of decision-making is at the district or the LEA for the LCAP, whereas it's primarily at the school level for the school plan. And again, the addendum is at the LEA level primarily. All right. So let's look at the CDE and how they define the planning process. The LCAP, as we mentioned, the LCAP and the school plan are plans, and they're most closely linked. And the CDE website includes a page titled Planning for LCAP and School Plans for Student Achievement. And what you can see here from that website is their view of how the LCAP and school plan can be aligned. They note the key differences, but they also, in other words, LEA level versus school level, 3 years versus 1 year. But they also note that the plans are similar in design and that the use of a shared vocabulary, a shared planning process that's embedded in continuous improvement should lead to greater alignment of those 2 plans. And on the next slide, we'll see a diagram of their view of how that should look, and it comes from that same web page. You'll notice this is another place Amy mentioned some inconsistencies regarding resource inequities. In this case, they apply resource inequities to all schools, so all school plans. So, and that's where they start. As shown here, the process should start with identification of resource inequities. Again, it's a school plan requirement, but it could have implications at the LEA level. Next, it moves to the analysis, which is part of the LCAP. There's an analysis section, but it's also reflected in the required evaluation that was discussed previously in the school plan. Once goals are established and actions are developed to address the goals, and measurable outcomes are designed to measure effectiveness. And this is a similar process for both school plans and the district LCAP. And all of these processes are informed by stakeholder engagement, and that's true at both the school and the LEA level. The optional CDE school plan template was designed to mirror the LCAP to support alignment. It hasn't been updated to exactly match the new LCAP, but that's the intent, that they have the same vocabulary, same process, and so the thinking is the same at both the school and district level. On the next slide, we'll take a look at a requirement that's in Ed Code for the LCAP, and it requires that the superintendent reviews school plans to ensure that the specific actions included in the LCAP are consistent with strategies included in school plans. And this alignment this is meant to support alignment and consistency. But we started asking ourselves, what does this mean and how does it really happen at the school level? And our sense is that in many cases, this isn't something that's happening or isn't happening maybe as well as it might be. So what does it mean and how do you do it? Well, we envisioned something when we thought about like what you see on the next slide is probably the current reality. So if you take a look at yes. So here's the superintendent at the end of the year reviewing school plans to ensure they're consistent with the LCAP and finally giving in and saying, yes, whatever you say, and buried. If that, I think that rings true even more this year. I think that looks like all of you out there this year right now. But that's sort of what, if you read it that way, that would be what that looks like. We kind of had maybe a thought that it might work a little better if we turn that around. So on the next slide, let's take a look at what that might look like in a model that is reasonable. First of all, it should be an ongoing process, not something you do at the end of the year, read the plans and then say, yes, they're aligned or not. That's not a continuous improvement model. That's sort of just a check-off compliance model. So this needs to be an ongoing process. What does that mean? It means starting with aligning the LCAP and school plan planning timelines. By aligning the timelines, schools and the district are talking about the same things at the same time. Next, you need to implement a process. So LEA staff have their ear to the ground during the school plan development process. District staff working on the LCAP should be aware of those needs that are arising from schools during the school plan needs assessment process. How do you know about those conversations? How do you know about issues and concerns that are arising so that can feed into the LCAP development process? If resource inequities are being identified at the school level, LEA staff need to be aware of that and determine if they should be addressed in the LCAP or if that's a school level issue that they need support with in that way. And if you hear that common needs are arising across schools, perhaps that's something that should be addressed district-wide rather than on a school-by-school basis. If you're hearing all your schools or most of your schools saying this is an issue, then that sounds like a district issue, not a school-by-school issue. And are there gaps in mandated services or basic services all students should be receiving? Well, then that again is a district-level responsibility and you should be attuned to that and be able to address it. So these things should be taken into consideration as the LEA moves forward with developing the LCAP goals. Right. Next, we'll start looking at designing actions and services on the next slide. And you first, the school level conversations again should inform the LEA when developing LCAP actions for all students, for various student groups, and for increased or improved services for all three targeting groups. And schools need to be kept in the loop as these LEA decisions are being made so they can understand how that might impact their school level program and help them in the design and planning of their school program for the coming year. Next, LEAs should look at their federal program services. Review LEA level services provided through Essa programs. So districts have Title II, III, and IV funds that are at the district level. Those are district provided services. And they also have possibly LEA reservations that are used at the district level. So it's important to determine if services align, if those services that are currently being provided with those funding sources align with the current needs that you're hearing from schools. If the program services need to be changed because what you're hearing as you work with stakeholders, work with schools, isn't matching what's happening, isn't matching the district goals, then that needs to be changed and reflected in a revision of your LCAP federal addendum. And important is to, again, keep the schools informed about these decisions along the way, because schools are impacted. Everything takes place at schools, services for students. So whatever is being provided from those federal funds also should be in the thinking as school site councils are developing their school plans. So keeping schools informed along the way it's not just a one-way, it's a two-way conversation. It needs to be an iterative process with information flowing back and forth from the school and the LEA, so decisions at both levels are aligned and not duplicative. And to ensure the requirement for an education code for the review of school plans to ensure the actions are consistent is actually happening. And again, not at the end, but along the way. But to plan effectively, schools also need to understand how LEA services from both state and federal sources are supporting schools so they can make the best use of their Title I funds and align the efforts with the goals and priorities of the district rather than making those decisions in isolation. So let's take a look at how that might look in the real world. And here's an example. Okay, we're thinking learning loss is probably a major issue in most LEAs, most school districts now. So learning loss is likely to come up as a need from stakeholders at all levels. So an LEA might decide they're going to have a goal addressing learning loss. This sends the message that this is a priority for the district. So putting those goals in place in the LCAP tells the district this is something we care about. This is something everyone should be striving for. To support that loss for all students, but because we know that all students are affected by learning loss, or maybe, the LEA may decide to have their professional development program focused on learning loss and include that as an action in their LCAP as part of their overall professional development program. They may find that there are specific conditions that impacted one or more of their 3 targeted student groups that have especially impacted them and created challenges in terms of learning loss or academic growth. And they may have specific additional actions to support those students in the LCAP. Then they may look at their LEA level Essa funds and decide to add additional supplemental professional development using Title II funds, prioritizing their CSI and ATSI schools because prioritization is required for Title II and they may have some needs there. Finally, they may also look at the professional development requirement embedded in Title III, and they may determine that there's some specific professional development required to ensure that English learners are supported with particular strategies. And all of these changes would be reflected in the addendum, the Title II and Title III, if they decide to do something there. So then, knowing this, schools can more effectively plan to use their Title I funds. They may start by asking if the LEA services from the LCAP and the Essa programs will be adequate to meet local needs. And they may decide, yeah, they are. If that's the case, they could decide to use Title I funds to support their teachers with implementation of the strategies that the LEA is providing through professional development. So it might be actually direct service to students to support those implementation. Or they may say, no, they may identify a more specific need. For example, they may find that learning loss has been especially impactful at their school for 2nd and 3rd grade students in the area of reading. And because research points to the impact on students of not reading by third grade, they may want to target additional professional development with their Title I funds to reading intervention in second and third grade. That might be an action they say, this is above and beyond what the district's providing us. You can see in this example how ongoing communication can lead to greater alignment of school and district programs and plans. Okay. So what about charter schools? Okay, we heard earlier that charter schools can use their LCAP for their school plan for student achievement if they meet federal requirements. So how would this process look for charter schools? Given the elimination of the LCAP last year, this is going to be the first year that charters can use this process. So how might it work? Well, it should be similar to what we just described, but it's going to be more integrated for them because the LEA and school are the same entity. So begin by asking, what are the needs of all students in the 8 state priorities? What about various student groups? What are their needs? What circumstances stand in the way for our English learners, our low income, and our foster youth? And all of that should be included in their LCAP. And then how are we using other Essa funds that we might have to supplement our programs? And then finally, looking at the Title I portion for their school plan, what academic achievement gaps are we finding, and how can we use our supplemental Title I funds to close those gaps? So the process, same process, but more integrated because they're one and the same. So hopefully that provides you with some thoughts about how those plans might be integrated and how that alignment might take place, as opposed to having some poor person, which could be you, sitting down and doing that alignment process at the end of the year. All right. Right. So we hope the last couple of days have been helpful to you. We are here all the time for questions that you have to follow up, but please put your questions. We've been noticing the questions in the chat, and we will get that Q&A out to you as quickly as possible. Everyone who's registered will get that document, and we'll also post it on our website. We'll also be posting the video of this presentation for you. And please, we'll leave it open for a few minutes. We beat the clock again, so by a few minutes. So we'll leave the chat open just for a minute or two if you have any additional questions. But again, please contact us anytime we can be of any help. And best wishes to you and all the hard work you're doing out there. Take care.